Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the three ambassadors. We're delighted that you took time out from meeting business people to come here and engage with the campus community. I thought that what we could do is kind of start with some open-ended questions. I know I have some, mine has collected quite a few from some students, and then we'll open it up to the floor later. But you three serve in such different countries with which the US has had such different historical relationships. And since the US Indo-Pacific policy is geared toward enhancing ties with allies, partners, and countries like Laos that the US would like to be an ally and partner, I was wondering if you could, expand a little bit on some of what the opportunities and challenges are. Obviously, in the case of Malaysia, the US has very robust military and economic ties. They kind of fly under the radar, but there's also been quite a series of tensions over the years related to the non-aligned movement. You see it today with Anwar's support for Hamas. So there's quite a lot of positives, but also series of tensions there. Laos, that tiny little landlocked country, when I tell my students that John F. Kennedy, according to Schlesinger, spent more time on Laos in his first year in office, they are shocked. But at a certain point in time, that was way high up on the US agenda. When I tell them that there was a US airlift, just like Berlin airlift, they're again a little surprised. Relations are not as close. It's a very small country. Obviously, a different set of challenges. I'd love to hear that. And in the case of Vietnam, I mean, who would have thought 50 years ago after the Vietnam War that today the most pro-American country, according to most opinion polls, is Vietnam. So the relationship has been on a huge upward trajectory, driven in part by some common economic issues, common fear of China, but lots of frictions over human rights, democracy, environmental issues. We're seeing the corruption campaign, the burning furnace, take down what many had viewed as reformist, even pro-American officials. So I'd love to hear how you navigate some of those challenges. We can start with over here.
So I think that, the first thing I'd say to all students, first of all, it's a tremendous pleasure to be here. And to non-students as well. And it really, from my perspective, one of the things that I think we are grateful to all of you for is that we need more people who know the Indo-Pacific and East Asia in the United States. This is an area that is going to be of tremendous importance to the United States in the next 30 years. I think our operating principle is that in the next 30 years, the combination of Southeast Asia and India will be to the global economy what China was in the last 30 years, in terms of being the largest single generators of growth. And we don't have enough people in the United States who really have connections to understanding of Southeast Asia. So I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank the Weatherhead Institute for the work that you've done over the years. But I would say that I think all of you who have an interest in Southeast Asia are actually going to find yourselves in great demand in the coming years. To answer your question, I think, look, every relationship is complicated in its own way. Sort of the Anna Karenina opening, and all of us face different challenges. But I think for Malaysia, we have on one hand, in many ways, one of the democratic success stories in Southeast Asia in the last 6-7 years, and a long history of close ties going back to the Malayan emergency in the late 1940s and 1950s, which was in many ways the first successful and stands out as one of the few successful counterinsurgencies, and so successful that it's actually completely, or not completely, but largely forgotten in Malaysia today. In many countries, one of the legacies of a civil war is if you look closely at political fault lines, they tend to be linked to the Civil War. And that's true in countries that we can all name, ranging from the United States to Greece. And so one of the things that happens is that it's very, very hard to cover. And the success of the Malaysian experience, I think, in some ways, is testament to the support they received from the UK, from the Commonwealth, and also a great deal of support from the United States. And that's still, to the extent that it is remembered, it's not remembered across the board. There's still appreciation for that. There's also appreciation for the US role in Malaysia's economic growth. The amount of US investment going back to the late 60s, which has really helped propel Malaysia. And a great deal of security cooperation and understanding that in a neighborhood that has a lot of uncertainty, that security cooperation with the United States offers reassurance. So I think all those things are tools. And yes, are there areas of disagreement? Of course. And right now, I think just to be very open, and I think it's not a secret to anyone, particularly this place, Gaza is a big issue in the US-Malaysia relationship. And one of the things about not having diplomatic relations with Israel is that when Malaysians want to express unhappiness about Gaza, they demonstrate outside the US embassy. And there's also obviously a large degree of assumption that the US is perhaps more directly involved than we in fact are, but that we are certainly an easy target to express dissatisfaction. And that's a challenge. On the other hand, I think that Malaysians understand the importance of balance. And while we can disagree about the balance of power, I think there's an understanding of the power of balance. And I think that there is a recognition that at a time when there's a great deal of geostrategic competition, that picking sides isn't a good idea. And the best position is to be in a situation where one can play off one side against the other, and that means maintaining ties with both. So I think that we do benefit from that. Anyway, long-winded answer, but hopefully that gives you some sense of where things are.
Thank you.
So as Professor Murphy alluded, the history of the US-Lao relationship is quite long and fairly fraught, at least at the beginning. Laos was involved. Our involvement with Laos started with the Indochina War in the 1960s. We dropped bombs on Laos every 8 minutes for 9 years. 270 million cluster munitions dropped, 80 million of which did not go off, so still exist, still cause injuries and deaths today. We have, I think, about 20 casualties, both injuries and a couple deaths this year alone. So at the core of our bilateral relationship with Laos is addressing those war legacy issues. The biggest part of that is our programs to help Laos clear and remove UXO from across the country. The United States is the largest donor working on this issue with Laos. We've contributed close to $355 million for the last couple decades, aimed at helping Laos remove those UXO which is the top national priority and for which they have their own special sustainable development goal. That assistance also supports education efforts as well as supports funding for programs to aid people with disabilities. Laos has also been very supportive of our ongoing effort to account for all the missing US service members in Laos from that period. So at the core of our relationship are these war legacy issues. I'm happy to say that over the years, our relationship has continued to normalize, and we are sort of at kind of the best point we have been since the war, where we do a fair amount. I'm coming from Philippines before Laos, so it's a very different relationship. We do a lot with Laos, including in areas that I was surprised when I was learning about it as I prepared to go out to post. So a lot in the areas of health, The COVID vaccines that we donated, although a fairly small absolute number, in fact, contributed to helping to vaccinate about fifth or seventh of their population, including children. So a huge benefit to our relationship. We do other work in the area of health and education, and in areas where we're working with the government of the Lao People's Democratic Republic to develop a commercial infrastructure so that they have the rules and regulations that will encourage other countries, particularly like-minded countries, United States and others, to invest more in Laos. So we have a whole range of activities and programs. And frankly, the comparative advantage that I think that the United States has in Laos is building that Lao capacity, building the capacity of the people of Laos, the country of Laos, to be a strong, stable, prosperous nation in the heart of Southeast Asia. This year, Laos is the chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. So they have a big role to play in that infrastructure. And so I'll speak a little bit about ASEAN. And the United States is strongly supports ASEAN and sees ASEAN very much at the heart of our Indo-Pacific strategy. And so we work with ASEAN as in a collective sense, but also then working with the member states bilaterally to advance US interests and support the region in its own goals of security and prosperity. So happy to talk more about other aspects of our relationship with Laos. But stop there.
Okay, thanks. I would also like to say thanks to Columbia University and the Weather Institute. Always wanted to, I always tried to get into Columbia, never made it, so this is a nice opportunity for me to finally say, made it. No, I mean, the US relationship with Vietnam is pretty remarkable. But not for all the reasons many Americans think. The common narrative, I think, is that sometime in the 1960s, the US and Vietnam, we found each other, to be at war with each other, in years of war and then isolation and then estrangement and then eventually normalization, friendship and the great partnership we enjoy now. But actually the real narrative, the real story goes back farther than that. And you have to go back to 1945, when the United States and Ho Chi Minh and his, in the Viet Minh that he was leading, we were actually allies. We were allies together in northern Vietnam in the fight against Imperial Japan. And we were so close, we were supplying Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh with arms and ammo and radios and maps, and Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were helping us to rescue downed American pilots. And again, we were allies in the struggle against Imperial Japan. Ho Chi Minh quoted from the US Declaration of Independence when Vietnam declared its independence September 2nd, 1945. Ho Chi Minh wrote a letter to Harry Truman, February 1946, pledging full cooperation, asking for US help in realizing Vietnam's ultimate independence from colonial France. Sadly, Harry Truman did not write back. And the rest we know over decades was, we started as allies, friends, and as friends sometimes do, we lost our way for 5 decades through war and isolation. But then 1995, we normalized relations. And now we're on the verge of celebrating next year 30 years of normalization of friendship, of partnership. And it's a remarkable journey that really began slightly more than 30 years ago with efforts that Heather described to account for missing American service members from the war, to deal with some of the other legacies from the war, to include unexploded bombs. The US dropped more bombs on a single province, Quang Tri province, than we did all of Germany in World War II, which is pretty remarkable, but in the worst way. So we're still working on cleaning those up. We're working on cleaning up Agent Orange, which is this defoliant that we sprayed, primary ingredient of which is dioxin, which is very bad for plants, but also very, very bad for human beings. And so we're trying to clean up those sites, as well as assist people who were affected by this terrible chemical, as well as people who suffered wounds due to messing around with unexploded bombs. But it was these efforts to address these war legacies, which created a foundation of trust, of confidence in each other, to build the relationship we now enjoy. And it's a relationship that encompasses everything from trade and investment to security and defense cooperation, science and technology cooperation, education, energy, climate, people to people, you name it. I mean, if two countries are doing something that's worth doing, it's the US and Vietnam are doing it. And we wouldn't be there, we wouldn't be here, without the brave efforts, the bold efforts on the part of individuals in both countries over many years. Individuals well known like John Kerry, John McCain, Patrick Leahy, individuals in Vietnam like General Vo Nguyen Giap, former Foreign Minister Nguyen Cu Thach. And then, people, just average Americans, average Vietnamese who worked very hard to build bridges between our two countries. Also great individuals, like Ambassador Osius, who works very hard on behalf of this relationship when he was ambassador, even before. And so I think, we are at a very important point in our relationship with Vietnam. President Biden visited last September. We upgraded our ties to the highest level within Vietnam's constellation of relations, comprehensive strategic partner. So now the trick is going forward, how do we implement this? How do we fulfill the promise of this relationship we now enjoy? It's a responsibility we now have to our two peoples to make sure that we stay true to our shared goals. Indeed, there are challenges, as Professor Murphy alluded. Human rights remains an issue that we address with Vietnam quietly, respectfully, but nonetheless in a way that's true to American values. And yeah, it's an exciting story. The journey is not over, but it's one in which I think as US and Vietnam are embarked on together.
Would you like to ask the question, or do you want me to ask the next one?
If you could continue, and then I will add on to that, because a lot of Southeast Asian students in SIPA were very interested, but unfortunately the event sometimes overlap with their class time, so they have sent me their questions so that I wouldn't be able to ask you later, but please go ahead.
Okay, so I'd like to ask about a criticism or frustration that many of my Southeast Asian interlocutors have with US policy, which is that they perceive that US policy towards Southeast Asia is often derivative of US grand strategy rather than an interest in their country's kind of intrinsic value. So, they usually say, gee, during the Cold War, Southeast Asia was viewed as communist dominoes because of its geostrategic location to China, and obviously what was happening in Vietnam. It was very high on the US agenda, fell after the Vietnam War. During the Clinton administration's promotion of liberalism, the countries were economic miracles. You had Thailand and others transitioning to democracy, so it got a fair bit of attention then. During the global war on terror, when countering terrorism was such a key objective, Southeast Asia was named the second front, something that provided an opportunity for countries like Thailand and the Philippines to enhance ties, become major non-NATO allies, but certainly caused tension with Malaysia and Indonesia. And now today, of course, it's geostrategic competition with China, which has once again raised Southeast Asia's place on the US policy hierarchy again. And the criticism is always, we just want to be treated as our own country. And so I'm wondering if you think that's a fair criticism of US policy. And do you find that you have to grapple with that in your work? And if so, how do you navigate that challenge?
Well, I think I'll start out, but I'm the US ambassador to Laos, and my priority is the US relationship with Laos. And that, it is a range of areas. And I think that Southeast Asia, having served in 5 different countries in Southeast Asia, there, it's such a complex and diverse place. And that I think certainly I would at the risk of speaking for Edgar and Mark, but we come at our assignments as, you know, as how can we build that bilateral relationship? There are issues that are cross-cutting and why we do more and more, I think, with with ASEAN. But at the fundamental basis of the work we do is the bilateral relationship and what is in the US interest in terms of building that relationship, and it varies from.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I look, I would reject the fundamental premise of
Okay.
that. I disagree. I think that the way to look at it is that there's long been a recognition, going back to the immediate post-World War II period, of the importance of Southeast Asia to the United States. The idea that at different times, the US has different priorities that help frame how we look at international relations, I don't think is a secret, nor should it be a surprise. But I think if you go back to our engagement with Southeast Asia, and I would argue that in many ways they go back to the late 40s and early 50s, there has been a consistent recognition of the region's strategic importance. And I think over time, the region's economic importance to the United States. And the idea that, you know, when September 11th happened, the idea that terrorism, counterterrorism became a top priority for the United States, that's not a surprise. And I would challenge the other thing is I would say that our relationships today with Indonesia and with Malaysia were actually strengthened by our work together on countering terrorism. So I think that the way to look at it is that this is a region and these are countries that have long been very important to the United States. We engage with these countries differently. We have two or treaty allies, Philippines and Thailand. Singapore, we have a partnership with Singapore that in many ways is very, very unique in terms of US access of US military forces there and the level of cooperation that we have, but also the degree of cooperation we have on economic issues ranging from trade to technology to investment to science and scientific research. So and then we have extraordinarily dense trade relationship with Malaysia, strong ties with Indonesia. So I would say that to me, what you're citing is a recognition of the fact that the region is always important. I mean, you can look at other regions of the world where US engagement dips significantly and doesn't necessarily come back. I think the fact that the way the lens through which US engagement with the region is seen changes based on what is happening in the US. I mean, it's like arguing that it's like complaining about the law of gravity when your suitcase wheel is broken. Yeah, it's annoying, but it's not a surprise they didn't repeal the law of gravity for the moment you had to go from the conveyor belt to your car. So to me, I think that Southeast Asians sort of understand that. And I think that they recognize that it is in their interest to be important to the United States, just as it is in their interest to be important to other major players in the region. So to me, it's a feature and not a bug.
Thank you very much. I love it when people rebut arguments.
I think the only thing I would add is probably just saying the same thing in different language, but
More diplomatic.
I'm just trying to think of a better metaphor than a floating suitcase. But no, I think just speaking of the US relationship with Vietnam, I mean, there's intrinsic value in Vietnam and in the US relationship with Vietnam, and it's not about Vietnam's position on a global strategic chessboard and how can we move this piece or that piece to satisfy our strategic ambitions in the region. It's about how does this relationship with the US and Vietnam benefit the peoples of the United States and Vietnam, and whether it's extending and diversifying supply chains, semiconductors, other important items. Of course, this benefits American consumers and manufacturers. This benefits the people of Vietnam, whether it's working with Vietnam on their clean energy future. Again, this is something that's got real value for American energy companies and Vietnamese people, and on and on. And so really, and it's a message we constantly sort of try to present that, you know, we're in this relationship with Vietnam, not for the sake, again, of some third party. We're in this relationship because of what it does for the people of Vietnam and the people of the United States. And I think this is true across the region and across the spectrum of other relationships we have in the region.
Thank you both all very, very much. May, why don't you take a question and then maybe I'll ask another one and then
Yeah.
we'll turn it over.
So, I do have two questions related to ASEAN as a whole. So I hope you're okay with it. But you did touch upon a very good point. I mean, a point that I found it very interesting. You said ASEAN is at the heart of the Indo-Pacific strategy, either through collective or bilateral partnership. So my first question is, what do you think is the strongest aspect of the US and ASEAN relation? Or what area do you think has the most potential to grow in the next decade? And my second question is because Dr. Murphy briefly touched upon the US China competition. So my second question is, what role can ASEAN play in the ensuing competition between US and China in the Southeast Asian region and beyond? And what is your take about ASEAN playing the central role in the region?
That's an open-ended
Yeah.
question. Maybe
Yeah.
one of you can choose to answer that.
I'm sorry.
I mean, I'm,
I mean, the first thing I would do is steal your line from earlier this week, so. you should-
oh, good, steal my line.
Just-
I know which
Form of
one.
compliment, right?
The one that talks about the fact that, you know, the ASEAN, and India to a certain extent are, you know, the largest are and will be the largest drivers of growth globally. And the United States is, are we the single largest, investor in Southeast Asia? So, so we have a huge interest in, building up that relationship, whether it's on the level of ASEAN or on the level of, the countries individually. And, you know, we see that ASEAN, the member states have, you know, gathered themselves together in an organization, that sometimes is hard to deal with, but is very critical to the region's, future and prosperity. And so that's why we see ASEAN at the heart of our strategy, because we want to work with the countries both individually and collectively. One of the things.
I guess from a strategic perspective, what I would argue is a couple of things. I think first of all, as I said, there's long been a recognition that Southeast Asia matters to the United States. And I think that importance is only going to grow for the reasons that Heather said. And there's a recognition also, and this goes back about 15 years, when the US sort of made a decision that, you know, for a long time, we were ambivalent about ASEAN. Because in many ways, if you were to design an organization, if you guys as a project were to get together, like design an organization that looks, that the US would not like, what would it look like? It would look a lot like ASEAN, right? Consensus driven, you know, very much like the most important decisions, and this used to be the case, it's a little bit less so now, made on the golf course between leaders. You know, no disagreement, no public disagreement, everything like exquisite politeness. I mean, that's not a recipe for winning over American policymakers. But there was a decision that was made, which was that if you want to have strong bilateral relations in Southeast Asia, that which we did and we do, that you can't avoid having a strong relationship with ASEAN, because ASEAN is so important to the countries in Southeast Asia. And, you know, you can spend time arguing, should that be the case, etc. But what we realized was we needed to just recognize this was a reality. So you can see about 15 years ago, a decision to upgrade our engagement with ASEAN, to send an ambassador, to accredit a permanent ambassador to ASEAN. We were the first outside country to do that. And that was actually a big deal. At the beginning, a lot of people were like, are you guys crazy? And now everyone does it. I mean, there's a whole cadre of ambassadors in Jakarta that are accredited to ASEAN who are not also accredited to Indonesia. 15 years ago, that was not the case at all. And you can see we've started participating in more of the meetings. And one of the things about ASEAN is, in addition to the things that are the most visible, sort of the part of the iceberg that's above the water, of the leaders' meetings and the foreign ministers' meetings, the defense minister meetings, there's a whole surface piece, which is like all icebergs, much, much bigger, of other ministerial tracks, of sub-ministerial tracks. And so, I think I heard Heather mention, I forget what the number was, so I'm gonna just quote her, like over 200 meetings. So hosting ASEAN or chairing ASEAN is actually a big deal because you have to organize all these meetings. It's also a big deal to participate because you have to send people to 200 meetings. And, I would say 15 years ago, it was hard to get different parts of the US government to do that. Now you can see US participation in the energy ministerials, the sub-ministerials. You can see participation in the education track and the parliamentary track that 15 years ago, honestly, it would have been really hard to imagine. So I think it's a recognition we need to be part of this, that we have an interest in working with ASEAN. And ultimately, ASEAN is important because they have managed to set themselves up as central to all the other things that happen in the region. And the only meeting that brings together all the major players in the region is the East Asia Summit. And so when we talk about ASEAN centrality, we're really recognizing that ASEAN has managed to make itself central in a way that everyone now accepts. And so I think that's why we need to engage with ASEAN. I mean, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy, which really highlighted the importance of ASEAN. I would just note for all of you, the Indo-Pacific strategy my office produced it at the NSC, but the drafter was Mira Rapp Cooper, who actually replaced me as senior director, who got her PhD from Columbia. So, you could see a Columbia influence. I should be embracing this. I can't talk that.
You just complimented the Columbia audience. Could I follow up on that just a minute? I'm so glad that you talked about the kind of subsurface meetings that are so important and where, a lot of things get done. But so often what gets focused on is, did the president attend the annual meeting, right? And that is the measure of quote unquote US interest, at least at a kind of surface level. And obviously any president's most precious commodity is their time. Going to an ASEAN meeting is 24 hours of travel, 12-hour time difference. I mean, it's a huge commitment. President Trump only made it to one. Biden earned a lot of credit for hosting the special US ASEAN summit in DC in 2002. He attended the first, skipped last year's to go sign a strategic partnership with Vietnam, which certainly didn't go over well in Jakarta, particularly since they moved the meeting to make it closer to the G20. So, I've heard some talk because Chinese President Xi Jinping doesn't attend, right? It's always been the Chinese premier. And given A, the difficulty of getting presidents, and B, whoever wins the election is going to be a fairly old man, that should the US just make a policy that the VP attends? And that way it's expected, there's no disappointments. And just kind of follow the China model. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I would say as a general rule, following the China.
I know, I should have phrased it that way.
Right, that we try to adopt. So look, you're right, this is a huge challenge. I mean, this is one of the things that is a challenge on a bunch of levels. I mean, part of it is obviously in our system, the president is both the head of state and head of government. The demands on a president's time are, I would argue, fundamentally different than almost any other world leader. And it's hard. I mean, I would tell you that President Biden was willing to go in 2021 when Brunei hosted, and they decided to make it virtual. So we didn't need to fully test that. But he was very clear with us, he was willing to go. Obviously, he went in 2022. And 2023 was a tough decision. And I think that it's got to be linked to also recognize that there was linked to trip to India for the G20. So there's a lot of travel and a lot of demands. The G20 has become, in many ways, a much more challenging and demanding thing as a result of the changes that you're all aware of. So I would, I mean, there's been, I've read stuff, I've heard debate. I'll tell you that if we were to go to President Biden, and I think that, certainly that would have been the case with some other presidents, say that it's a matter of policy, the president's no longer going to be presidential. I don't think he would like that. Because I think he recognizes the value and the impact of going. He was disappointed not to go the last time, and there was a lot of demands, and there was a tough decision. But my view is President Biden would not be willing to make a decision to back away from tenets of the East Asia Summit. Because ultimately, the ASEAN meeting really is about the East Asia Summit, and it's worth keeping in mind. The East Asia Summit is somewhat unique because not only does it bring together ASEAN, but it brings together key players in a way that you've got India, Russia, China, the US, Korea, Japan, all at the table, and Australia and New Zealand, all there. So this is not an unimportant thing. And I think that you'd have to get a president to be willing to say, I'm going to decide I'm not going to go, which is very different and in many ways harder than deciding I am going to go.
Thank you. Any other views or? No? Do you have one more question and then we'll open it up, May?
Well, I guess, it's a very easy question compared to the previous question, but, my friends who aren't able to, attend today, they just very curious about, what advice can you give us as students and future practitioners of international relations? In general, and international relations in Southeast Asia.
Well, you're doing the right thing by studying here at Columbia. And particularly an institute that's devoted to the study of East Asia, Southeast Asia. I think it's being curious, being creative, it's looking for opportunities. There are so many opportunities out there, professionally and intellectually. I think it's seizing those opportunities, and not letting any obstacles prevent you from doing that. Among other things.
I feel like maybe I'm preaching to the converted in saying this, because so many of our students here are from overseas and already speak multiple languages. But for me, as an American student, when I was in university, just learning foreign languages, and then seeking opportunities to study abroad. I mean, that was for me just completely life-changing, eye-opening, whatever, however you want to put it. I did a sort of a internship between my junior and senior years in Japan. Then I went to Japan after graduation for a year and a half. And just to have had that experience, learning a foreign language, stepping outside my comfort zone, taking risks, changed my life and set me on the course that I'm on today to eventually become a diplomat and serve not just Japan, but in also other countries as well. And so, again, so many of you already are very internationally minded. You already are at your comfort zone. You're here in New York City. I'm from Los Angeles, so I'm outside my comfort zone. No, but I think it's just really, I commend all of you who've chosen to study this area, to live overseas, to travel, to study, to learn different languages. That's really key and a very special hallmark, I think, of future practitioners in this really important field, especially in this day and age where we need folks who understand each other and can build bridges and break down barriers.
I agree completely with both Heather and Mark, but I would add one other thing is try and learn about technology. One of the really interesting changes, I'd say in the last 5 years, I really noticed this in my time at the National Security Council, is that so much of what we work on now really is linked to technology. And I would say that most diplomats, most people in government who work on this actually don't know that much about it. And the comparison I would make is like, 50 years ago, 55 years ago, most people who studied international relations or involved in foreign policy knew something about strategic nuclear issues because it was such a big topic everywhere you went. And so people were forced to sort of learn about it and could talk about it. And that didn't necessarily mean you were an expert. The difference now is that technology is way more complicated. And it's arguably just as important. And we have much less understanding of it. So we are in government, we're dependent on a very small number of people who really know this stuff. And I think that as a diplomat, it is much, much harder to be effective without having a better understanding. So how many of you here have read chip wars? Okay, so like, basically, the number of people I know who know much more than what's in chip wars, not include myself, is frighteningly small. So I would say if you're thinking about preparing yourself, and this is true, anything you want to do in international relations, try and find some way to learn about the basic principles that deal with semiconductors, that deal with things having to do with AI, with quantum. These are going to shape the world that we live in, particularly you, to I think an extraordinary degree. And I actually think that in general, we are collectively underprepared to really understand them and understand the linkage between these issues and policy.
Can I follow up on that?
Go right
You
ahead.
Brought up Chris Miller, who is also a Yalie, and the Vietnam Executive Leadership Program that was last hosted at Harvard. Next year, we'll be here at Columbia, brought Chris Miller to speak. And one of the questions that was thrown out is the capacity of Southeast Asian nations to really be competitive in this chip war on semiconductors. And of course, there was an article about Malaysia's ability. Where do you three ambassadors see Southeast Asia's ability to compete in this sort of high-tech space? We know, yes, we can speak with that. That was the first question. Tying it in a little bit to a second one, which maybe applies a little bit more to Laos, but the three of you really bring up the sort of baggage of the 20th century that we still have today in the 21st century, which is US policy towards decolonization in Southeast Asia and the subsequent 50 years. Legacies of war I really see as affecting Laos much more in many ways than Vietnam and Cambodia. But how much of this can the United States sort of jump over and really deal with issues that are very much more 21st century? Can we get rid of that decolonization baggage? And if we can't, or how would you see it as three ambassadors in terms of explaining to Washington, DC, that, if we don't surmount certain of these challenges, we can't really sort of promote better relations with these countries in Southeast Asia. And this does, of course, apply to Malaysia. I think I disagree with you and agree more with Professor Murphy's and Marie's question that, in many ways, Southeast Asia is an afterthought. And this is something I teach my students because Dorothy Borg always says Asia was never in the forefront of American leaders' minds and vice versa, particularly for Southeast Asia because it was colonized by European countries except the Philippines. But I'll leave it there first with this high-tech space, semiconductors, Southeast Asia capacity, and then also baggage, historical baggage.
Well, so let me take both of those questions. The first, I'm going to answer the first sort of from the angle of my previous assignment in the Philippines. And I think we all have some of these stories. The Philippines does semiconductors and was during the pandemic went to huge lengths to make sure that they kept their semiconductors supply chains running. Detroit would have shut down without the wiring harnesses that the semiconductors from Philippines supply. So I think that in varying degrees, Southeast Asia and is very much at the heart of some of these issues, and certainly countries like Philippines and others are trying to move up the value chain to play a greater role in that area. So I think it's very timely and very, very much a part of their calculation. With regard to the second question, you know, the Americans in general are not good historians or, you know, rememberers of history. So I think we do have to keep our history in mind, especially when in the case of Laos, people are still dying from things that we did 50 years ago. So I think we forget that at our peril, but what we need to do is move beyond it, certainly. And we need to, you know, work with our partners as well. You know, in the Lao government, many, you know, for many people, the war is still a lived experience. And so we need to remember and respect that. I think that we are doing a lot with newer generation in Laos in particular. We do a lot of English language instruction, for example. And we, you know, it's very exciting to see the young people of Laos embrace learning English language, embrace, you know, the wider world in a way that thanks to technology, they have access to that perhaps their parents did not. So, you know, providing those options but keeping in mind that history, I think is the way I approach that.
Yeah, everything I know about semiconductors, I owe to Chris Miller and Shapur. But I think, you know, Vietnam already has a very strong foundation in terms of assembly, testing, packaging, which is kind of the fundamental sort of activity one does when in the semiconductor supply chains going around the world. Their desire, and one that we hope to work with them on, we are working with them on, is moving up the value chain to higher value efforts like chip design. And so, you know, one of our conversation, ongoing conversation we've had with Vietnam is about creating an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem that can support increased participation in semiconductor supply chains. It's not about, you know, having TSMC or Samsung or somebody coming in and building a fab and then walking away. I mean, this is going to take decades, right? You got to start small. You got to start with baby steps. Among these are having a workforce, right? You need a workforce to be able to work in these super high tech facilities. And so that's engineering education, that's STEM education, starting early, elementary school even, you know, boys and girls, and ensuring that, you know, you've got the computer scientists, the technicians, the engineers to be able, you know, 80,000 is one estimate Vietnam needs over the next 7 or 8 years. You got to have access to energy, reliable and hopefully renewable sources of energy. And the more that you've got sort of AI calculations involved, again, I learned this from Chris Miller, AI calculations eat up 10 times as much energy as other calculations. I'm not sure why exactly, but somehow that's the case. And so, I mean, this is a hugely daunting task for a country like Vietnam. In fact, Singapore is turning away data centers because it just doesn't have the power to run them. You need clean water because some of these high-tech manufacturing processes require clean water in order to do whatever they do. And you need access to trusted IT infrastructure, meaning that if you're going to have some high-tech company invest in your country, you can't have anybody concerned that their IT or their IP is going to get ripped off because you happen to be connected to a Huawei undersea cable. So anyway, this is an ecosystem. This is something we talk to Vietnam about all the time. And I know you heard it at VELP up at Harvard. But it's something I think Vietnam is well suited and well prepared to take on. But don't expect, you know, again, TSMC to sort of build a factory next week, and it's going to take time.
And I would say that, you know, in terms of technology, that right now, that turns out to be one of Malaysia's big advantages, because there is an ecosystem. They would like to move higher up the value chain into the ecosystem. But, you know, the amount of investment in tech-related fields in the last 3 years is extraordinary. And a lot of it is American or companies from other countries that are basically servicing US supply chains. So I think Southeast Asia has tremendous potential. And I think for a couple of reasons. One is that, you know, American companies and other international companies, multinational companies involved in technology have been in Southeast Asia for a very long time. The initial US investments in Malaysia by Texas Instruments and Burroughs go back to the late 60s. Intel was, I think, 1972. And the footprint is significant and it has generated the ecosystem that Mark talks about. So I think this is an opportunity, and also it's worth remembering that, you know, many companies are making decisions, not necessarily to pull out of China, but they're looking to not necessarily significantly scale their investment in China and are looking to put facilities in other places. Southeast Asia is a logical place, given the history of US investment there and other multinational companies. I mean, they can be Japanese, Korean, European, Australian. You can see a significant amount of investment in Southeast Asia and India. And so I think that what you're going to see is the region continue to develop in that. Now, will it be at the very cutting edge? I don't know. And I think that's a real question. There are going to be a number of things that influence that. Will it be critical for those at the cutting edge? Absolutely. And I think Mark's point about Singapore, you know, Malaysia is a beneficiary right now in terms of data centers. For data centers, there, it turns out, I didn't know this, but there are three big things that people care about. One is electricity. Two is water, and three is basically seismic stability and, you know, how vulnerable are you to natural disasters? And those three things point to, I think, a lot of, in addition to the pre-existing structures and relationships and infrastructure, do point to Southeast Asia in ways that I think will lead to much more involvement in Southeast Asia by companies that are pushing the boundaries on tech.
Thank you all. Okay, so we've gone from history to high tech. At this point, the floor is open. If you could please raise your hand, and if I call on you, if you could just stand up and say your name, please. We'll start with you in the front.
Hi, I'm Jiang Hao from engineering school at Columbia.
Mhm.
So I'm interested in politics, but my major is computer science. I think that's my brief introduction.
Okay.
And so my question is related to Vietnam. So Vietnam is always like trying to balance between US and China and some factions within the party, I'm not sure I can pronounce it correctly, sorry. Like the General Secretary Ren Fu Chung's, do I pronounce it correctly?
Yes.
Yes, prefer to strengthen the ties with China. We can see this trend in recent years. And because he visited China in 2022, just right after China's Party's Congress, and some other factions like former Premier Ren, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ren Chen-chung.
Wen Tanzu?
Oh, Ren Chen-chung, yeah, lean towards a closer relationship with the United States and instead of China. So and we know like there is an upcoming power transition in Vietnam in January 2026. It's their 14th Party's Congress, and General Secretary Ren Fu-chung is expected to retire after this Party's Congress because his physical health situation. And yeah, and sorry.
So your question.
So sorry. Just let me complete it. Sorry. And currently various like factions within the party are like competing for the position for the like Chung's successor and other key positions. And President Wu Wen-chung has resigned last month. And a few days ago, the assistant of Wong Ting-hui, the chairman of the National Assembly, was arrested. And so I think the current Vietnam's internal politics kind of unstable, and it's still unclear who is the next general secretary will be. And so therefore, I believe that the post Ren Fu-chung's era could be both unstable and unpredictable, because we don't know who is the successor right now. It's just, the Party Congress is 2 years later, or less than 2 years later. And, so I'd like to ask Ambassador Knapper how the US plan to shape its, foreign policy to navigate the post, Ran Fucheng era in Vietnam.
Thank you.
Well, after that long wind up. I regret sort of giving a rather sort of curt answer, but I learned early in my career not to try to speculate on what's going on, especially in a public forum, what's happening internally, either within the government or the party of the country in which I'm currently serving. I need to keep this job for another year or so. But yeah, I mean, I know there's, everybody's always talking about who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out, which faction. I mean, there's, yes, I mean, you could say that about virtually any country, including our own. Suffice to say, as we've, you know, over many years, the United States has worked with different leaders in Vietnam, whether party leaders, government leaders, just as Vietnam has worked with different presidents of the United States and different leaders in Congress, regardless of party, whether it's Democratic Party, Republican Party. And so I left my, you know, magic 8-ball in my office back home, but whoever, you know, emerges in whatever leadership process takes place over the next couple of years, the United States will be prepared to work with that individual for the betterment of our two countries' relationship and our two countries' peoples.
Okay, other questions? Glenn?
Sure. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Weatherhead Institute, also a professor at Fulbright University, Vietnam. Thanks so much for sharing. My question actually comes in response to something Ambassador Kagan said, but it's directed towards Ambassador Variaga, because when I see your CVs and your backgrounds, I notice, you know, that there's something in common, which is, you know, Ivy League. So background for you, except for Ambassador Variaga, who, you know, of course, your undergrad at Georgetown, it is sort of a place that sends a lot of people to diplomatic service, but also Sussex, a place that teaches a more critical bent of international relations, famously, right, the home of the European Journal of International Relations. And so really, part of my question is, how much space has there been, have you seen in your career in diplomatic service in the US for sort of more critical perspectives and voices in diplomatic service, whether some of these backgrounds have helped you in some of the posts that you've been serving in particular Laos, and how good your golf games are, I suppose. It's clearly, you know, and I know this, you know, my dad's an ambassador too from Vietnam. He tried to make me learn golf. I said, I quit diplomatic service. He says, you need it. I said, I quit, you know, you know, like, can you do it without a good golf game? How good is a golf game?
I got my husband to take up golf, actually. No, so, you know, you asked a very good question at the heart of it. And I think that you can frankly be a critical thinker and creative thinker through attending a variety of universities, not just one or another. You know, I will say that as the U.S. ambassador to Laos, as a U.S. ambassador, regardless of the country to which I'm posted, my job is to advance the interests of the United States as articulated by the administration in power at the time. I've worked, as my bio said, since 1996, so both Democratic and Republican administrations. And, you know, it's a fundamental tenet of the work that we do that if we have such a disagreement with a policy that we cannot advance it, then we should leave. And I know diplomats who I respect very, very highly have taken that option on occasion. There are mechanisms for debate and in even dissent in the State Department. It varies from agency to agency. and I think we do see healthy debate and discussions within the State Department about US policy on a range of issues. But ultimately, if we are to perform our role properly, particularly as ambassadors, it's to support the policies of the government we're representing.
Okay, other questions? We'll go over here, please.
Adam Nico, sort of picking up the conversation we had yesterday at the Edge Society. Ambassador Pan, you spoke obviously the boundary of focusing obviously never snapping, to obviously have this great resilience in a current context within it. I'm just curious to sort of expand upon that. Is it based sort of on the fundamental sort of concept of pragmatism? And under what circumstance would you see this sort of diplomacy snap to one side or the other, whether it's the US or China? I'd be curious to know what circumstances you would see that to be, and perhaps as well, fellow ambassadors, what your thoughts would be with regards to Malaysia and Laos.
No, I mean, ultimately, bamboo diplomacy or omnidirectional diplomacy, whatever you call it, has served Vietnam very well. The only country to host both President Biden and President Xi in a single year was Vietnam last year. And I think it's just representative of, as they say, the tyranny of geography. I mean, Vietnam's in a tough neighborhood with lots of big neighbors. And it's represents, I think, a reflection of Vietnam's longstanding and traditional relationships, friendships, whether government to government or party to party among countries like the United States, Russia, China, India, the EU and others. As for snapping, certainly that to me that implies sort of making a choice. And the US policy is not to force countries with Vietnam or others to make a choice. As Secretary Blinken often says, we want countries though to be able to choose, to have the wherewithal to choose without coercion, without being bullied, without being forced to do so. But countries ought to have a choice, but we don't want to have to make them do that. And our goal is to ensure that either through trade or investment or security cooperation, that countries have the flexibility and sort of again wherewithal to be able to choose as they wish in a way that's best for their national interests and for their people's security and prosperity.
I think this is not unique to Vietnam. You're not getting around the geography of Southeast Asia with a large and powerful neighbor to the north. But the US is a large and powerful nation with interests in the region and an interest in working with the countries of the region, both individually and collectively. So I think working with our friends and partners in the region and beyond to offer options to our friends and partners in Southeast Asia is pretty fundamental to what we're trying to do.
I just argue, I think all of you are familiar with the concept of the distant balancer. And, I think the countries in the region, I would argue, see the US as a bit than just a distant balancer because we have been such important investors. Trade with the US has been so important for so many countries. And so I think that, the answer to the question is, I'm not sure what it takes for countries to snap. But I think it's probably an action by one of the major players that makes them feel like they have no choice in terms of what to do. And I think that from a US perspective, our goal is to avoid that. And that our goal is also to make sure the countries have as many tools as possible and in order to defend their sovereignty, defend their interests. Because ultimately, we believe this is at the heart of our goal of free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the countries basically have options and choices on how they choose to advance their interests.
Okay, I'm gonna take one of the online questions because we haven't gotten to any there yet. And one of them says that we have heard a lot about what US interests in Southeast Asia are, and the questioner wonders if you could each provide a little insight into what the country in which you serve most wants from the United States and whether or not the US is in a position to grant that wish.
Well, I wouldn't exactly put it in terms of, the US bestowing upon,
I agree
these,
with-
these countries, waving a magic wand or something. But I think in the case of Vietnam, one looks at the aspirations, the high goals that Vietnam has set for itself in the decades ahead, whether it's to be a net carbon zero economy by 2050, whether it's to be a high income economy by 2045, to have a digital economy by 2030, et cetera. Every one of these goals, every one of these aspirations and the efforts to achieve them involve the United States. Whether it's government to government efforts that we have underway, whether it's our academic institutions, whether it's our research institutes, whether it's our American companies, multinationals that are investing in Vietnam, training their workforce. All of these goals that Vietnam has, the US is inextricably linked to. And not just the US, but our partners like South Korea, Japan, and others. And so, and I dare say we are linked in a way that our competition is not. And this is something I think we shouldn't take for granted. We need to, like a garden, you got to constantly cultivate this relationship and ensure that our goals and those of Vietnam are in sync. But I'm confident that for now, and in the time ahead, we're going to be not always in lockstep because we don't agree on everything, but we are basically marching together in the same direction. And our job is to continue that effort.
Thank you.
In the case of Laos, they have some fairly specific goals, to no longer be a least developed nation by 2026, to remove UXO by, as a barrier to sustainable development by 2030. And, and to grow their country economically and develop social and economic development. They have a national 5-year plan. So those goals very much align with, US priorities in Laos. And so I see a lot of complementarity in terms of what they wish to do and how we can help. So I think those are areas that we're that we're working very closely on. We don't always agree on, some of the goals, and we aren't always able to provide the support or the assistance in the way that perhaps our partners would wish, but we work together to find the best ways forward that advance both of our agendas.
I think, both what Heather and Mark said, relevant for Malaysia. I would say that what Malaysians want is continued access to US markets, and continued investment from the US, continued engagement by the US in the region in ways that helps preserve stability. I think that, frankly, what they also want is a reduction in friction between the US and China, which on one hand, I think most countries in Southeast Asia are not unhappy about it because it actually competition with the US and China creates opportunities for them. But at the same time, they would like greater confidence that the competition will be managed in a way that doesn't lead to conflict. And I think that that's something that's, they're still looking to both the US and China on, though I think that what's happened in the past year and a half since the meeting in Bali, and I would argue in the last 6 months since the meeting in San Francisco, I think has helped reassure. But, the reality is that, and Pastor Ossie has said this more eloquently than I, so I'll just shamelessly plagiarize, they don't want conflict, but they also don't want a G2. And so balancing between that and ways that offer the most opportunities for them is, I think, something that every country in the region wants, with all of them wanting to do it in different ways and focusing on different priorities.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for the conversation. I'm Cheryl, a student here at SEPA. I think a lot of international relations students now are interested very much in climate risk. So I was just wondering how much of climate change or climate diplomacy is featured in your work in respective countries.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam is one of the world's
Did I hit something?
Was that understanding?
What did I do? Oh. I inadvertently hit the mute button. It's not my computer. My apologies. Go ahead.
No, I mean, Vietnam
I don't need it anymore.
okay. No,
I'm usually text that.
yes. No, I mean, Vietnam is one of the world's top 5 countries vulnerable to climate change, the effects of it. You know, in our efforts, whether it's clean energy, renewable energy, transition, whether it's our efforts to deal with the effects of climate change in the Mekong Delta, whether it's our efforts to make coastal communities more resilient to natural disasters. These are all things we work with Vietnam on a daily basis. And I know it's true, you know, with other partners in Southeast Asia. But it's a real thing. I mean, salination of the Mekong River is a real thing. It's happening. You know, we're assisting farmers to figure out how to adjust their rice crops to have a more saline, saltwater resistant crop, or switching over to say, you know, half the year they do rice, half the year they do shrimp. I mean, these are real world impacts that the US and other partners are having in Vietnam to deal with for their real world effects of climate change.
That's, I think, in all of the countries I've served in Southeast Asia, we do a lot in the area of climate environment. And it's often through US Agency for International Development, and programs tailored to the needs of that country. In the case of Laos, given its, you know, the fact that it, you know, has 4 or 5 neighbors, and the Mekong runs right through it, a lot of the work that we do, with Laos in terms of environment is regionally based, and through work in the Mekong, our Mekong US partnership, the Mekong River Commission, and other areas, you know, doing just what Mark described in terms of both environmental protection, but also mindful of the livelihoods that Great River System supports.
And I think that for Malaysia, there's this sense of frustration because they are exposed to the effects of climate change, and it is a very important issue. Probably not as much as Vietnam, but you know, looking at a ranking of how exposed you are on climate change, is it very satisfying if you feel like you're getting whacked by climate change? So, you know, I mean, this is an important issue. The reality is there's also some frustration because whatever they do for themselves, Malaysia is a comparatively small source of global emissions. And so the challenge is that, you know, in order to deal with the demand, to mitigate the risk of climate change, the impact of climate change, you got to do 2 things. One is, you know, have as much influence and hope that there is a global agreement that leads the very significant emitters to reduce. And at the same time, take actions to be more resilient in terms of the impact of climate change, to really start moving towards adaptation. And there's also an economic aspect, which is trying to take advantage of the opportunities that come from building clean energy, renewable energy economy. And all those things are interlinked. They're all comparatively hard. I think there's a recognition these are important. And there is a strong desire for partnership with outside players, be it the United States, be it Japan, Australia, Korea, Europe, China, because there's a recognition that all these things will require a great deal of capital, and they, you know, want to try and look for opportunities to get technology and capital in order to gain economic benefits from the transition, but also to start doing the very tough work of adaptation and mitigation in order, in part, to have a seat at the table for global efforts. I mean, you know, in many ways, the benefit of significantly reducing emissions in Malaysia on a global level are relatively small. But for the Malaysian government, they recognize they want to have a seat at the table and influence what happens globally. They need to actually be taking their own actions. And so I think all those things mean that climate is an extraordinary opportunity for partnership, because there's a desire for US technology, there's a desire for cooperation, there's a desire for investment. And so that's something that is a really important part of our discussions with the Malaysian government. And where I would argue they are probably looking for even more from us than we've been able to give, in part because they sit in a tricky place as an upper middle income country, where they're not eligible for a lot of the different programs that we have. And at the same time, there's the cost of basically mitigating the marginal ton of emissions in Malaysia is actually quite high relative to many other countries. So that creates some challenges, but I think that it also creates opportunities because we have to be creative, but the things that we're able to do actually matter tremendously to them. And I would argue that having the example of a country like Malaysia making a transition to clean energy is very powerful in the region and globally, as well as obviously creating opportunities in terms of our relationship with Malaysia.
Well, I think you will all agree that we got a fantastic survey of insights on US ties with Southeast Asia from Ambassador Snapper, Barriaga, and Kagan. And you also got career advice. You need to read your board. And before we close it out, I would like to invite Ambassador Ted Osius to say a few words.
Thank you. Thanks to our moderators, thanks to our host. But as co-host, I wanted to answer two of those questions, come back to two of the questions. I also want to thank our ambassadors who have gone to event after event after event during these last 2 days and are not flagging. And so I really appreciate that, really appreciate it. But I feel like your question is a very important one for those who are considering their futures. And I agree 100% with what Ambassador Barriaga said. Especially if you're an ambassador, you can't freelance. If you believe in a democratic system, then you can't go out and say, well, here's my view, and the president's view is this, I don't really care. You can't do that if you're going to represent your government. It's not an option. However, your highest loyalty is to the Constitution. All three of these ambassadors swore an oath to the Constitution, not to any president. And I got to the point in my career where I thought my oath to the Constitution was more important than my loyalty to the president. I had to resign. I had to be one of those officials who left, because we have to remember who we are as ethical human beings. The process of making policy is not a passive one. The people you see in front of you are actively engaged in the iterative process of policymaking at all times. You don't just receive it and passively accept it. They shape it. And that's really critical. But when you get to the point where something snaps and you can't shape it any longer, but then you do have that responsibility to remember your ethical principles and remember your oath to the Constitution. And sometimes that means stepping aside. The other question, which I think came from one of the students who couldn't make it on career advice. I loved serving as an American diplomat for 28 and a half years, privilege of a lifetime. But there are ways to do international relations and to serve one's country even outside of officialdom. I made the jump over to Google, and I found out that actually when you're in the private sector, there are times where you can mobilize resources and make things happen that are beyond what governments can do. That's a legitimate way of providing public service as well. So that whether it's in the private sector or in NGOs, there are a huge number of opportunities to be engaged internationally. I think this profession is quite a noble one, and absolutely worth considering, but it's not the only option you'll face. But